here. Right? Good evening. I'm Aurelian Cayuzzo. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department and the faculty sponsor of the PP Society. David is currently occupied with bringing the pizza, which is the most important thing, but we'll get started and then there will be opportunity to share this. It's my pleasure to welcome my colleague Jeff Isaac, who is the Rudy Professor of Political Science in the Department of Political Science. Jeff has been teaching at IU for a very long time, since 1987. He's a legendary member of our department and a very passionate activist in the name of democracy, liberal democracy, writing a lot of stuff, present on Facebook and other social media. We invited Jeff to speak today about an important topic that will resonate with most of us, I hope, and it has to do with the way in which censorship and fight for truth coexist in our society today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here and to speak with you on the topic of the Red Scare, free speech, and democracy, then and now. I'm not a fan of prepared lectures, but today's topic is urgently important, and since I've been asked to give a talk, I've prepared a lecture. I've written it to be engaging, and I've timed it at 40 minutes. I'm confident that I will spark your interest, and I look forward to a vigorous discussion when I'm done. My talk is scholarly and intellectual, but it is also political. And while I'm speaking at the invitation of a student group and to an audience consisting mostly of students, and while my job is the job of a teacher, like when I am paid to be a teacher in the classroom, I'm not speaking to you as a classroom teacher, but as a political scientist who's also a writer and a citizen who believes that the honest sharing of informed perspectives is the hallmark of a free society. Some of you are in my class, but this is not my classroom. I'm talking to you as young adults and citizens who asked me to come and speak. Freedom of speech is currently under attack on American campuses and in the society at large. And the assailant, the attacker, is the Trump administration and its supporters in state governments like the government of Indiana. Central to this attack is a relentless propaganda campaign against the left, both broadly and with specific reference to the socialist left. In 2024, by the way, you can maybe do the PowerPoint thing, move it forward one.
The clicker is right in front of you.
I don't know how to do this. Here. Click.
That's a challenge.
It doesn't matter, I'm just going to talk.
It's the side button.
Whatever. In 2024, Trump committed himself, and I quote, go one further. Yeah, there, thanks. He committed himself to protecting students from the radical left and Marxist maniacs infecting educational institutions. He also pledged to root out the communist, Marxist, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country, that lie and steal and cheat on elections. Actually, he said this in a speech on Veterans Day 2023, which I guess was 2 years ago. In his speech commemorating the 2025 4th of July, a couple of months ago, Trump denounced what I'm quoting, vile creeds such as socialism, Marxism, and straight-up communism, declaring, and I quote, that America is never going to become communist in any way, shape, or form. And as president, he has explicitly called for crackdowns on what he calls the radical left, issuing an executive order dedicated to countering left-wing domestic terrorism, that's domestic terrorism, and pressuring universities to purge anti-American courses, programs, and faculty. The deployments of federalized National Guard troops and active duty U.S. military personnel charged with preserving law and order in the face of anti-ICE protests represent one form that this crackdown is taking. Another is the targeting of the left for investigation and prosecution that is outlined in two presidential memoranda that Trump signed in late September. One, countering domestic terrorism. You're in the way of my recording. Go that way. It's very important that I be seen and heard, not just heard. Yeah. Thanks, man. I'm kind of teasing, but also really serious. Okay. Two memoranda. One, countering domestic terrorism, and the second, designating Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. These memoranda coincided with Attorney General Boundy's announced investigation of the Soros-funded Open Society Foundation. which is an NGO that funds lots of liberal causes. Full disclosure, decades ago I received a Soros grant. So too did Viktor Orban, the authoritarian prime minister of Hungary, responsible for turning the name Soros into a synonym for evil on the American right. The overall purpose of these measures was well described by Stephen Miller, President Trump's ghoulish advisor in all things cruel and unusual. And I quote him, "This is the first time in American history that there is an all-of-government effort to dismantle left-wing terrorism, to dismantle Antifa, to dismantle the organizations that have been carrying out these acts of political violence and terrorism." He's talking about things like the assassination of Charlie Kirk, which he says was done by left-wing organizations. And Miller, like Trump, has made it very clear that this is an all-of-government effort to dismantle the left. The Trump administration has also brought extraordinary pressure to bear on U.S. universities in ways that impact not only academic freedom, but freedom of expression, by seeking to punish those faculty, staff, and students, and especially international students, who are considered to be woke or anti-American or engage in activities that are anti-American. Trump administration pressure, combined with state-level pressure, has impacted us here at Indiana University, where the Whitney administration, eager to comply with new state laws and to avoid Trump Education Department harassment, has moved to suspend the Palestine Solidarity Committee, to discipline Professor Ben Robinson on the basis of a single complaint, and to suspend the social work lecturer Jessica Adams also on the basis of a single unadjudicated complaint. To be clear, some of you may know about this, the Whitney administration pioneered these repressive tactics even before state legislation was passed. In early 2024, suspending my friend and colleague, tenured Professor Abdul Qadir Sino, canceling the Samia Halabi exhibit, and then calling state troopers onto campus along with snipers on the roof of the IMU to violently disband the peaceful encampment on Dunn Meadow in the spring of 2024. These things happen. These developments have garnered extensive national media attention and have led FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, a libertarian free speech organization, to rank IU, our beloved university, 255th out of 277 U.S. universities in its college free speech rankings, and to feature an overview of IU under the title Indiana University's Free Speech Crisis. The topic of free speech is a very broad and complicated topic. In the U.S., it is inextricably linked to the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which states, and I'm reading, some of you, probably many of you have heard these words before, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." Now, the amendment's purpose, central purpose, is clearly the protection of individuals and groups from repressive federal government activity, and by extension, especially since the passage of the 14th Amendment, government activity more generally. It is also clearly relevant to a broad range of issues beyond simple protection. There is a substantial case history of First Amendment litigation. I am neither a constitutional lawyer nor an expert on the case history, but I am a scholar who spent over 40 years studying and teaching about democracy, the history of democracy, and justifications for democracy, and also justifications for attacks on democracy. And because I was asked to speak on the topic of free speech broadly, today I will tell a story about one important moment in the history of debate and contestation about freedom of speech in the U.S., and that is a series of events in 1919 surrounding three major Supreme Court decisions that were taken in connection with the U.S. government's enforcement of two pieces of legislation, both designed to support U.S. entry into World War I, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. In what follows, I will draw on a range of primary and secondary sources, and especially on two important, relatively recent books, Adam Hochschild's 2022 book, American Midnight, The Great War, A Violent Peace and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis, and Ernest Freeberg's book, Democracy's Prisoner, Eugene V. Debs, The Great War and the Right to Dissent. I'll first tell a story about the first Red Scare. I'll then turn briefly to consider three consequences of that historical moment, roughly 100 years ago. Finally, in a very brief conclusion, I will draw some lessons from this story. My primary goal is to incite you to further thinking. The situation today is in many ways very different than the situation back then, but there are also striking similarities that are worth taking seriously. So, part one, the first Red Scare in democracy. In April 1917, the U.S. entered World War I, which had been in full force since August 1914. In June 1917, Congress passed an act called the Espionage Act. The act made it a federal crime, and I'm quoting now, to make or convey false reports or false statements with intent to interfere with the operation or success of the military or naval forces of the United States, and I quote, to cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the military or naval forces, or, and I quote, to willfully obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service of the United States. The act also empowered the U.S. Postmaster General to declare any material that violated any provision of the Espionage Act or that urged treason, insurrection, or forcible resistance to any law of the United States to be unmailable. Use of the mails to transmit such materials was punishable by imprisonment and a fine. Postmaster Albert S. Burleson wielded these censorship powers enthusiastically. And by war's end, many of the nation's widely circulated radical newspapers and magazines had been repeatedly held back from distribution, and many were driven into bankruptcy. Liberal and radical journalists complained to President Wilson that his postmaster was violating the First Amendment. But the president generally supported Burleson's decisions, and Burleson went ahead and did this. How many of you heard about this? Okay, good. Good that 3 of you out of a group of like 30, most of them are American citizens, or at least many have heard of it. A year later, I'm being facetious. More people need to know about this. A year later, the more restrictive Sedition Act was passed, which outlawed, quote, disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language against the flag, the Constitution, or the uniform of the United States Armed Forces. Those who continued to speak against the war risked heavy fines and jail sentences of up to 20 years. That year also saw the passage, by the way, that year also saw the passage of the Dillingham-Hardwick Immigration Act. How many of you have heard of that act? It allowed for the United States government, and I quote, to deport certain undesirable aliens and to deny readmission to those deported. Hundreds were deported under this act without the benefit of a hearing, the most famous of whom was the anarchist Emma Goldman, a Lithuanian Jewish immigrant who had lived in the U.S. since she was a girl in 1885 and who was arrested, denaturalized, and deported in 1918. I'm going to talk a little bit about denaturalization in a few minutes. That's the stripping of citizenship rights. She was a naturalized citizen through marriage, but as part of her conviction for violating the Espionage and Sedition Act, she was denaturalized. She was sent packing, never to return. Over 1,000 U.S. citizens were convicted of crimes under these acts, many subjected to long prison sentences, many deported. The most famous of these cases was the 1918 conviction of Eugene V. Debs, the well-known leader of the Socialist Party who had 4 times run for president in 1912, garnering almost 1 million votes, which was 6% of the popular vote. Debs was tried and convicted, supposedly in violation of the 1917 Espionage Act, after giving a powerful anti-war speech in Canton, Ohio, on June 16, 1918. And it's worth noting, and Debs' biographers point this out, and a close reading of the speech, I think, makes this clear, that he deliberately did not criticize the draft or call for draft resistance in the speech because he knew he'd be arrested if he did so. He was arrested anyway. Debs' conviction was upheld by the Supreme Court in March 1919 in a unanimous ruling explained very tersely in a short opinion written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., the famous jurist. The Debs case was one of 3 hugely important cases decided by the court in 1919. And while it was by far the most politically important case, Debs was an important public figure. He ran for president a 5th time in 1920 from behind bars and again gained almost 1 million votes. His demands for his clemency were widespread, and became a cause célèbre. And in 1921, he was finally, very famously and publicly released from federal prison. But it was the other two cases that were more important in legal terms. And I want to talk a little bit about each of them. The most famous case was Schenck versus United States, decided on March 3rd, 1919. Charles Schenck was a member of the executive committee of the Socialist Party of Philadelphia, which printed and mailed 1,500 flyers to conscripted men, encouraging them to resist the draft. Schenck was arrested and convicted for violating the Espionage Act. The court upheld the conviction in a unanimous decision. Writing for the court, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. argued, and I quote, "Words which ordinarily and in many places would be within the freedom of speech protected by the First Amendment may become subject to prohibition when of such nature and used in such circumstances as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils which Congress has a right to prevent." It was this decision in which Holmes wrote perhaps his most famous words, and these are the words. You've heard at least some of them before. "We admit that in many places and in ordinary times, the defendants, in saying all that was said, would have been within their constitutional right. But the character of every act depends on the circumstances in which it is done." And these are the famous words. "The most stringent protection of free speech, would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic." Now, Holmes's clear and present danger doctrine is a very important doctrine that eventually came to be interpreted as a relatively stringent limit on governmental interference with this free speech of dissenters. But his formulation of this doctrine in this case was intended to uphold Schenck's conviction. On Holmes's view, the pamphlets that Schenck was circulating against the war jeopardized the war effort and were thus the equivalent of falsely yelling fire in a crowded room. The rejoinder, of course, was that the war was an enormous fire and the yelling was a truthful warning for citizens to escape and put out the fire. Also, and importantly, as a conservative legal scholar, Ernst Freund pointed out in a law review article, Schenck and his comrades were nothing more than minor irritants whose agitation had little actual effect on anything. The idea that anything they did constituted a clear and present danger, approximate danger, really was very implausible. And yet, this was Holmes's decision in this case. Many scholars have pointed out that what he was really doing is reiterating the common law idea of seditious libel. The third important case was Abrams v. United States, decided on November 10th, 1919. Jacob Abrams was one of 6 Russian Jewish emigres connected with anarchist and communist groups who had distributed flyers printed in both Yiddish and English, criticizing U.S. war policy, specifically criticizing the U.S. effort in 1918 to undermine the Bolshevik government in Russia. He was convicted of violating the Espionage Act. The court upheld the conviction, holding, and I quote, "While the immediate occasion for this particular outbreak of lawlessness on the part of the defendant alien anarchists may have been resentment caused by our government sending troops into Russia, the plain purpose of their propaganda was to excite at the supreme crisis of the war disaffection, sedition, riots, and, they hope, revolution in this country for the purpose of embarrassing and, if possible, defeating the military plans of the government of the U.S. and Europe." While the Schenck and Debs decisions upholding conviction were unanimous decisions based on the logic of Holmes' Schenck's opinion, and in both of those cases, Holmes wrote for the unanimous majority. In the Abrams case, which also upheld conviction, the decision was made by a 7-2 vote, with the dissenting opinion being authored by none other than Oliver Wendell Holmes. This is what Holmes said in his dissenting opinion. By the way, if you use the PowerPoint, I put it up there. Keep going, red baby. This is what he said. Okay. You know what? I'm not going to read it at the same time. You can read it. Okay. But basically, what he did was he strongly critiqued any form of restraint of freedom of expression, except under the most severe circumstances. And he basically used the language of persecution to describe any such restraint, and argued that what was necessary was basically the free play of ideas. He actually cited John Stuart Mill on liberty. And he basically changed his mind. And in this case, he articulated a powerful critique of the kinds of punishments that were conferred on Schenck and on Debs and on Abrams and the other defendants, although he never admitted to being wrong in those other cases. But this was a very important decision, and so Holmes argued that the Abrams conviction should be overturned, and he implied that the Espionage and Sedition Acts themselves were unconstitutional. He lost the argument, and Abrams and his fellows were convicted, sentenced to 20 years of hard labor and a $1,000 fine. This was in 1919. Eventually, 2 years later, in 1921, they were released from prison on condition that they'd be deported, which they were never again to return. These were immigrants to this country, some of whom had lived in this country for a very long time, and at a time before it was common to get papers very quickly. They had family in this country, and they lived in this country. They spoke in this country, and they were deported. The mentality on display here was well described by the writer Randolph Bourne. War, or at least modern war, waged by democratic republics against a powerful enemy, seems to achieve for a nation almost all that the most inflamed political idealist could desire. Citizens are no longer indifferent to their government, but each cell of the body politic is brimming with life and activity. We are at last on the way to full realization of that collective community, in which each individual somehow contains the virtue of the whole. In a nation at war, every citizen identifies himself with the whole and feels immensely strengthened in that identification. And of course, as he also pointed out elsewhere, if you didn't, you were told to shut up or put in prison or kicked out. This was not, Bourne was one of the most vociferous critics of this, but he's pointing out that this was part of the war policy, and in fact it was justified as part of the effort to make America safe for democracy. That it was collectively beneficial, that it was based on legislation that was supported by majorities, and it was legislation that was supported by a president who was democratically elected. Okay. That was the brief account of the first Red Scare. I want to talk briefly about 3 consequences of the case and then draw a couple of lessons, and then leave time for questions, comments, criticisms, whatever. For the sake of today's topic, I'd identify 3 important consequences of these cases and the broader closure of political discussion that they signified and supported. The first and most obvious is the shift in Holmes's view of the First Amendment. While in Schenck and Debs, he deployed the clear and present danger standard to support the repression of dissent. In the Abrams case, he interpreted this standard to support a strong bias against any state-enforced restrictions on speech. This shift had an important, powerful influence on subsequent legal doctrine in the United States, and it has been the subject of much discussion among legal scholars. If you're interested in the law or planning to go to law school, you'll probably learn about this. It's really important in terms of legal interpretation. One excellent source about this is historian Thomas Healy's 2013 book, The Great Dissent, How Oliver Wendell Holmes Changed His Mind and Changed the History of Free Speech in America. Now, it is worth reiterating that in 1919, Holmes failed to convince 7 of his 9 fellow justices. To the extent that the changing of his mind changed the history of free speech in America, this did not happen very quickly, and it happened in a very uncertain and precarious way. Now, the second consequence that I want to call attention to helps to explain Holmes's shift. The emergence during the war of a vigorous movement dedicated to defending civil liberties. The National Civil Liberties Union, formed in 1917 by socialists Crystal Eastman and Roger Baldwin, in 1920 was reconstituted as the American Civil Liberties Union. How many of you have heard of the ACLU? It still exists, with a board that contained many of the most prominent liberals and socialists together in the country, including Helen Keller, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, John Dewey, Jane Addams, and Felix Frankfurter. Closely linked to this organization were a number of important civil liberties defenders, attorneys, and intellectuals. 2 in particular, Zechariah Chaffee, Jr., a Harvard law professor, and Harold Lasky, at the time a lecturer at Harvard, who was one of the most important political theorists of the 20th century. These two people played an important role in changing Holmes's mind. And they also played an important role in the post-World War I defense and expansion of First Amendment protections, an expansion that has continually been challenged ever since. So the one consequence was this shift in legal doctrine, which is important. The second is the civil liberties organizations and movements that helped to prompt this, that were very important, that played an important role at this time, and at other moments has played an important role, both in litigation and supporting people who were persecuted, but also in public opinion. Now, the third consequence I want to briefly mention, which is related to the first two, was less heartening for civil liberties: the decimation of the Socialist Party and the Socialist left more generally. As Adam Hochschild puts it in his book, and I quote now, "The Socialist Party would never recover from the mass jailings and the crushing of its press that took place under Wilson. Had it not been so hobbled, even with a minority of voters, it might have been able to push the mainstream parties into creating the sort of stronger social safety net that people take for granted in Canada and Western Europe today." That's a direct quote from him. He talks about this a lot. It's not simply with regard to social policy, but even with regard to democratic reform and civil liberties reform. The decimation of the Socialist Party was a very consequential thing. Accompanying this development was the de-radicalization of the early civil liberties movement, something that's charted in a very interesting book that I recommend to you by legal historian Laura Weinreb. The book is called The Taming of Free Speech, America's Civil Liberties Compromise. Of course, neither the socialist left nor free speech itself was ever fully tamed. But for the rest of the century, the left was both marginalized and subjected to repeated civil liberties assaults during World War II, during the Cold War, during the 60s, and now. This came at a great cost to democracy, not only because the suppression of dissent always harms democracy, but because in the early years of the 20th century, and this may be surprising to some of you, it was the socialists, more than any other party, that strenuously agitated for robust freedom of expression on principled grounds. As Eugene Debs put it in his 1918 appeal to the jury that convicted him, and I'm briefly quoting from a long and very powerful speech, this is what he says toward the end of his speech. "I believe in the Constitution of the United States. Isn't it strange that we socialists stand almost alone today in defending the Constitution of the United States? The Revolutionary Fathers, who had been oppressed under King rule, understood that free speech and the right of free assemblage by the people were the fundamental principles of democratic government. The First Amendment is perfectly plain English. It can be understood by a child. I believe that the Revolutionary Fathers meant just what is here stated, that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." And pretty clearly, the three laws, the espionage law, the sedition law, and the immigration law, did exactly that. Okay, so what? I'm almost done. So what? Why does this matter now? I hope it's clear that I have presented a very simplified version of the story of the suppression of civil liberties during World War I. Everything I've mentioned merits much further attention, much further attention. I'm actually teaching a course on it in this spring. Everything I've mentioned merits further attention. Most importantly, U.S. history did not end in 1920 or 1940 or 1960 or 1989 or 2008 when Obama was elected and a lot of people got all excited, or in 2020 or in 2024. History never ends. It is continually unfolding and being made, including right now. The late great sociologist C. Wright Mills, who's an intellectual hero of mine, famously wrote back in the late 50s during the Cold War about the present as history and the future as responsibility. Today is tomorrow's history. Tomorrow is today's responsibility. We are now living at a moment of crisis for free speech, the First Amendment, and civil liberties more generally. Political opposition is being demonized, surveilled, and in some cases prosecuted. Critics of the United States government from other countries are being denied visas, or if they are here on fellowships or as holders of student visas, they are being harassed, sometimes detained, and deported. Major American cities are being turned into mini police states in which ICE agents, with the support of the FBI, the Border Patrol, and other federal police forces, freely roam streets and neighborhoods, detaining people without proper papers. And I mean this in two senses. The people being detained don't have papers. They don't have papers. Prove to me that you're an American citizen. I posed this question to one of my classes a couple of weeks ago. I pose it to you right now if I went around the room. And I said, prove to me you're an American citizen. How many of you can actually prove? Like, do you have your passports? Do you have your birth certificates? So, like, you do. Good for you. Really. Plus, I see a lot of people here with not white faces who look to me like they're aliens. Aliens. Maybe illegal aliens, but aliens nonetheless. They freely roam the streets without any paperwork, without any warrants, detaining and deporting scores of thousands of people with no due process. Some of these people are American citizens. Some of these people are the friends of American citizens, the co-workers of American citizens, the children of American citizens, people who work on our campus, in our restaurants, in our landscaping companies. A new McCarthyism, mimicking both the first Red Scare and the second one at the height of the Cold War, which is another story, is casting a pall in academic life on university campuses across the country, with our own Indiana University competing with Texas and Florida for the title of the most reactionary public higher education in the United States. This is happening here and now. Indeed, what is happening on our campus and in our community in Bloomington is powerfully depicted in a new documentary produced by two Bloomingtonians, Jackie Comforti and Bob Arno, who are my friends and colleagues. The film is called Freedom's Under Assault, and it's actually having its pre-premiere this coming Saturday afternoon at 2 p.m. at the Buskirk Chumley Theater. I highly recommend this film. Of course, this time is very different in many ways, too many to discuss now, than the time of the first Red Scare or the second. We are not now subject to laws like the Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917 and 1918. We're not subjected to Palmer raids of 1918 and 1919, which led to the arrests and convictions of thousands. We're not subjected to these things yet. We have not seen the kind of denaturalizations, stripping of citizenship rights, and mass deportations of dissenters with immigrant backgrounds that led to the deportations of Emma Goldman or Jacobs Abrams and his fellow defendants yet. But there has been extensive talk among MAGA leaders about denaturalization, and indeed a June 11th, 2025 memo from the Civil Division of the Trump Justice Department called for prioritizing denaturalization. All these things can be found on the web. I'm happy to share them. And a number of prominent spokespersons of the MAGA movement, including Congresspeople Andy Ogles, Randy Fine, and Nancy Mace, and media personalities Steve Bannon and Jack Posobiec, these people have millions of followers, have called for the stripping of Democratic Socialist Zohran Mamdani of his citizenship. He's now the elected mayor of New York City. Who knows? Who knows? These things are happening now. While our country is not at war, it is worth reminding you that President Trump has frequently declared that the country is being invaded, that we are being attacked from an enemy within more dangerous than any external enemy. Indeed, in a recent speech to hundreds of generals and admirals that he and War Secretary Pete Hegseth called from all corners of the globe to come to Quantico Base in Virginia to be lectured, he declared, some of you may have heard of this, that the U.S. Armed Forces should be prepared to be deployed on U.S. soil and in U.S. cities to fight the war against the enemy from within. These are the words of Donald Trump. In other words, against civilians, whether they be immigrants without papers, or immigrants with papers, or American citizens who protest his policies. And so those of us who care about the fate of democracy in America ought to be paying attention and asking themselves hard questions about what's going on in our name and what it means for our individual and collective futures, and what might be done about it individually and collectively. As was true back during the first Red Scare, the courts are one important venue where threats to civil liberties are contested and litigated. And there are a range of important organizations now that are taking the lead in this litigation. Among them, the ACLU, States United Democracy Center, Democracy Defenders Action, Democracy Forward, the American Association of University Professors, the aforementioned FIRE, the Brennan Center for Justice. These are very important civil society organizations that are supporting litigation against the many people who are being unfairly arrested or prosecuted or deported. But there are many courts and many venues in the US at different levels. And courts are often unreliable, and the Supreme Court right now does not seem hospitable to litigation that challenges the Trump administration's executive authority. And so I think while litigation is important, there are limits to what litigation is going to accomplish. We'll see this in the coming term. We'll see what the Supreme Court does with a couple of really important cases that relate to these things. And then we'll see if it rules against the Trump administration, what the Trump administration does. But there's also politics. Without civil liberties, there can be no meaningful democracy. At the same time, without a vigorous, mobilized democratic politics to support them, civil liberties are deeply vulnerable always to the designs of authoritarian leaders and governments. And it remains to be seen whether a democratic politics with sufficient vigor and persistence will yet emerge, it has not yet emerged, will yet emerge, and whether it will be able to hold off the assault on civil liberties that is proceeding right now around us and for us, of us, for us, with us, and what, and so what. What does it mean for us? What does it mean for you? Thanks for listening. I welcome your comments. I'll take questions and comments.
And there is pizza that probably should be circulated.
That doesn't seem like a lot of pizza.
There's also tea. I think we can take question.
If I were in charge of this club, it would be better pizza. Where's this? Oh, Godfather's pizza is really good. Oh, no, that's great.
Right?
Yes, yes, I know you.
What can we do? Like here, campus with our government, like I know voting's important obviously, but what can we do? I knew that Professor Jessica Adams, who was removed from her class. What can I do as a student?
You know, I have, there are some answers that I can provide. I'm not going to evade your question. But especially in this venue, in this context, I'm wondering if other people have ideas about that. Like, we're at the point, on the one hand, you're asking me a question, I'm the invited speaker. On the other hand, you're asking a question that has to do with what's to be done, which I have no expertise on. I mean, like, I know some stuff, I'm a political scientist, but I can't tell you what to do. Is anyone doing anything, by the way? What can we do? Is anyone doing anything about this stuff now? And by the way, I want to be really clear. I want to remind you, 77 million people voted for Donald Trump. Everybody in the United States is not troubled by the things that I talked about. And that's an important fact. I don't presume that everyone in this room is troubled. As a teacher, I never presumed that, and in any context. And we do live in a free society. I value that, which means I also welcome people who want to criticize what I'm saying. I don't presume that everyone here is thinking the same about what to do. But I hear what you're asking. So with regard to that question, is anyone here doing anything? No. Yeah.
I think this is somewhat of a start. Holding an event like this, you guys attending these events, informing yourselves about what's happening in your country, I would say this is a good start. And I would encourage you, especially you underclassmen, if you want to get involved with PPS or start your own organizations, get involved there on campus, extracurricular activities, do enrich the experience for the students and open up your mind to the fact that you're a citizen, that you're a human being, as well as a student.
That is such a politic answer. You're the president of this group, right?
That's right.
And such a suit, I'm impressed. Seriously, this is a good guy. This is a start. That said, beyond this, here we are at this. What else can we do? Is I think the question, right? Because you're here doing this. Anyone have any ideas? Yeah.
I know for me, I like to just make sure I'm staying informed with up-to-date information, not just like following our social media page and just listing whatever, like if I see like a court case going on about with something regarding this, I go look at the actual like document papers or like also reading actual books.
Actual books? Wow.
When you said the Great Descent, I actually picked up that book in the library, so I intend to read it.
Excellent.
But I think that's just like the biggest thing you do. I mean, it's really hard to fight against someone who has knowledge.
Yeah. By the way, that's sometimes true. It's also very easy to put people with knowledge in prison. It happens all the time everywhere in the world, and sometimes even here. So, but by the way, I think these are really these are important answers to the question. We are on a campus. It's very important to point out events like this, groups like this, discussions like this are important. Education is important. Reading, learning, informing yourselves, keeping aware. These are the most important things that we encourage in our capacity as classroom teachers or as pedagogues, But again, I'm here primarily now as a fellow citizen. I happen to have a PhD and to be all the wonderful things that Professor Crayutu said about me. What did you say? I'm legendary? This is a nice way of saying he's old. But politically, by the way, campuses are sites of real politics. And of course, all of you, how many of you actually go off campus sometimes? Oh, all of you sometimes venture beyond campus. That means you venture into domains where you can interact with other people who aren't students or professors. And what?
How about beyond Kirkwood?
Beyond Kirkwood. Right. Yeah. By the way, on Kirkwood, I really encourage you to go see that film at the Buzz Chum on Saturday. But so there's a whole domain of political involvement off campus. Okay, there are also political groups on campus. Like it just so happens that I am the faculty advisor. By the way, all of these different roles, they're different. And I think they involve a different set of constraints. I'm very mindful of this because I'm actually a liberal, although I'm not a moderate. So I actually happen to be the faculty advisor of one of these groups. It's called Voters for Tomorrow, and it's a voter registration, a democratically oriented group. It's actually pretty liberal in terms of its background, but it's about voter registration at a time of the limits of voter registration in lots of places. So, that's a thing. There are many different groups on campus, and I certainly think that it would not be hard for you to discover others. Is anyone here involved in the Palestine Solidarity Committee? One.
I was.
You was. You were.
Yes.
Okay. So, by the way, that's an important group. By the way, I'm not involved with that group. I personally would not say that group is primarily involved in addressing the issues that I'm raising, except in one respect. That is a persecuted group. Okay? And right now on campus, that is a pariah group whose academic freedom in some ways has been restrained. They have an interest in free speech. And in fact, I do think that people involved in that group are involved in other efforts on campus that are trying to resist some of these restrictions on academic freedom, which is not quite the same thing as restrictions on freedom of speech legally, but they're related. So, people who are involved with or were involved with the PSC can talk to you about that. Obviously, I mentioned a bunch of legal groups, NGOs. because I think they're doing really important work now. And the reason why I mention them is because it's important to support them. Your students, you don't have a lot of money. I, donate to all of them, right? And I didn't always. Right now, I think that litigation is a really important bulwark. So I take that really seriously, All of those kind of groups, there's opportunities for interning or, doing volunteer work. And then, of course, there's politics. There's politics. Precisely what that means, just out of curiosity. And again, I'm not here to prescribe to you beyond what I said. Okay, I'm not here to organize people politically, and in fact, I don't represent any group, and I'm not really a group person myself. I'm not like an organization. Okay, but I'm curious. How many of you attended one of the No Kings rallies on the square? I'm seeing 3 or 4 or 5 hands. Okay, so those were actually fairly substantial public demonstrations on the square. Most people were going to the football game, to be honest. That's your plight if you care about these things.
It's a great team this year.
Yes, I know. Okay. I seriously cannot root for any IU sport team right now. Okay? So, not that I ever really cared that much about IU sports. In any case, so there's stuff going on campus. No Kings was a coalition of many groups. But it involved the Monroe County Democratic Party. Look, I teach a course on this. I'm not organizing or signing people up or mobilizing people, but I feel very comfortable saying, in my capacity as a scholar of political science and drawing on much important scholarly research, that in this country today, only one of the 2 major parties is a pro-democratic party. The Republican Party, under the leadership of Donald Trump, is against constitutional democracy. Because of everything I said and lots of other stuff that I didn't say. But that's an arguable position. I'm not here to ram it down anyone's throat, but I stand by that. I could cite to you many, many important, prominent political scientists making these arguments, and open letters, some of which I signed, by hundreds of scholars of democracy pointing this out, and dozens and dozens of former Republicans, dozens and dozens of people who worked in the first Trump administration, who are saying that. How many of you have heard of this guy, Miles Taylor? So Miles Taylor is an IU grad, and he worked in the Department of Homeland Security in the first Trump administration. And in 2018, he actually published an anonymous piece in the New York Times that got tons of attention, basically saying there are hundreds of people working in the Trump administration who are terrified that every day the government is being destroyed from within, and we're doing our best to keep alive the spirit of public service. That was him. He didn't come out until, I think, 2020 as the author of that. He's actually speaking to my class in a couple of weeks. He wrote a book called Blowback about this. Again, he worked in Trump Homeland Security.
There's a degree in political science.
I know. Well, I think it's in Hamilton Luger also. Whatever.
It's in political science.
Okay, it's in political science. Whatever. Anyway, yes, he's a really good guy.
And he fears being persecuted now. He's
He's-
apparently on this list of people who have been
It's more than a
singled out
list.
as because
Yes.
enemies who have to be,
Donald Trump
which is just
issued an executive order in the spring that named him. I can send you the link. It's like the executive order for threats to national security. Miles Taylor must be investigated. He also had an executive order naming Christopher Krebs. Christopher Krebs was the Trump-appointed head of the cybersecurity agency in the first Trump administration. And after the November 2020 election, Krebs and his staff, like 2 weeks after the election, put out a report saying, based on all of our research, this is one of the cleanest elections that the United States has ever had. There's no evidence of any tampering with ballots in any place. He was, of course, fired. But again, in the spring, an executive order was produced targeting him as an individual. Okay? Anyway, so, look, again, these are facts. Okay? Now, there is a strong counter-argument to the claim that only one of the parties is democratic. I'll tell you what the strong argument is. Democracy doesn't need civil liberties and constitutionalism and individual rights and pluralism. Democracy is the rule of the majority. We have the majority. We rule. That's a different version of democracy. That is the Trump version of democracy, the Orban version of democracy, the Bolsonaro version of democracy. It's anti-liberal. It sits very uneasily with the Constitution of the United States, I must say. But in any case, the point is, so there's politics. How many of you have heard of the online platform, The Bulwark? So The Bulwark was created by former conservatives who were pro-Reagan. They worked in the Reagan administration. They worked in the first Bush administration. They worked in the second Bush administration. Some of them worked on the campaigns of John McCain against Obama and Mitt Romney. They were basically Republicans until 2016. They were the first never-Trump Republicans. They were like, by the way, you may remember, in 2016, 17 people ran to be the Republican nominee. And Trump destroyed them all. No one thought he would win. I never thought he would win. Every conservative luminary, he eviscerated. And some of them now, with their tails between their legs, like Marco Rubio, work for him. Okay? But at that time, the Bulwark people were like, we're never Trump Republicans. They used to write for another periodical called The Weekly Standard. All their funding was pulled away when they started criticizing Trump. And they created this web platform, which I sometimes publish in, even though I'm not a former Republican of any kind. But these are important. So the point is, what I'm saying about politics, electoral politics, the partisan politics, I'm not just saying this. How many of you heard of this guy, J. Michael Luttig? If you're in my class, you heard of him. He's probably the most prominent conservative legal thinker in the United States. He served on the federal court for like 15 years. He was appointed by George H.W. Bush. On January 5th, 2021, when Donald Trump was trying to pressure Mike Pence, the vice president, to refuse to acknowledge, to validate the Electoral College victory of Joe Biden, the staff of Pence called J. Michael Luttig because he's a very famous conservative. He mentored a number of Republican senators, people even, I think, Clarence Thomas maybe. Anyway, and Luttig said it's against the Constitution, you can't do it. And Pence didn't do it. Luttig was the most important witness before the House January 6th committee in June of 2022. And he went from, and in 2024, he endorsed Kamala Harris very publicly. And like many of these people, I am a conservative. I don't agree with anything that Kamala Harris says about public policy. But she supports constitutional democracy, and Donald Trump doesn't. Liz Cheney, many others. So, you know, there are a lot of people who aren't like liberals or on the left who would say to you right now, if you care about these things, there's one party that's worth supporting.
Can we take more questions?
Of course you can. Yeah. Yes.
Great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
My question is more based on what you were trying to say when you were talking, like how divided America is, and that, you know, Trump voters, they don't really care about the crime now that it's happening. Like
Or they like it.
Yeah, they don't empathize with like the groups. And as an international student, I just wonder, like, why is that? I don't know if you have any questions, and perhaps my American politics knowledge here is a little bit limited, but I wonder, and I remember your class, the class that Mary's in, that in the first day you asked students, if a friend of yours disappears because, you know, ICE got them, would you like go after them? Would you lose some sleep? And the majority of them said, no, I wouldn't. And I was there, I saw that, and I just, it's confusing to me. Like, you're in a, you know, in an environment where you expect people to care. I expect Trump voters not care like if I disappear tomorrow. But we are in an environment where people, at least we expect that people are like highly educated, they're aware of what is going on, and we don't see that. We don't see that like people joining and fighting back. We see like the no kings protest, but you know, like once every like 4 months, once a semester, that's really like opposition. So what is happening? Like I feel because as a Brazilian, I feel like against Bolsonaro, we were a little bit more organized in terms of, you know, expressing how upset we were. And here, I feel like people just are accepting the fate of what is going on.
Well, you know, I have a number of different answers to this, and then I'm curious to know what other people think. In Brazil, you guys had to fight for democracy fairly recently. There's that, like, memory, almost muscle memory, you know, that most Americans don't have. And even those of us who remember that, in fact, you know, the civil rights movement wasn't that long ago, but it kind of was. You know, when I was your age, like what was 60 years ago was like black and white ancient history to me. We're talking about, you know, some of your parents were born after the civil rights movement. So part of it has to do with how historical memory and a certain respect in which things are taken for granted. And some of what's going on now is unprecedented in American history, although there are precedents like the Red Scare, okay? So that's part of the answer. Another part of the answer, I think, is this, and it's the part that is very important to my teaching because I'm serious about historical understanding, but it's exactly the stuff that, you know, if the conservatives have their way, this stuff won't be taught in public schools. It's that there's that American history is a history that involves some moments of great progress. But American history is also a history of reaction and racism and xenophobia and exclusion. And these things, power, they're very powerful. You know, so one of the things I talk about a lot, a little bit in the class that you sit in on, a lot in one of the other classes. So on January 6th, when there was the insurrection at the Capitol, some of these people were carrying American flags, right? And some of them were carrying Trump flags. And some of them had Confederate battle flags. What's that about? The Civil War ended in 1865, right? And you probably see these flags, insignias on trucks and in Monroe County and wherever you're from. Like that, the ethos of the Confederacy never died in many places. It still lives, okay? And it lived in the George Wallace campaign. It lived even in the Reagan campaign. It lived in Trump campaigns. And many, well, I won't go on to say. So that's part of it. That history is strong. It's not just something that we left behind. It's very strong. The other part of this is a general question about why people aren't more activated for all kinds of reasons. But there also are people who are activated, you know. I think in Chicago, in Portland, in New York, in these cities that are being invaded, it's not the majority of the people, although, by the way, the election of Mamdani is a very important thing. And he won a majority of the mayoral vote. And it is not true that his candidacy was just about, like, housing, okay? He ran very explicitly as a democratic socialist and a Muslim and a supporter of Palestinian rights and an opponent of Trump, okay? And for his campaign from the start, you had Trump saying this guy should not be a mayor. And I don't know what I'm going to do if this guy is mayor. And we don't know what he's going to do. You know, the National Guard could show up in Manhattan. But so there are glimmerings of people standing up, you know? And I think that's important. But you're right, it's an uphill battle. It's an uphill battle. It's always been an uphill battle. Other questions? Maybe even someone who wants to criticize me? Seriously.
I don't know if you'll find that in this room, maybe.
I would like to criticize.
Believe me, I know you would like to criticize.
I think if I listen to your talk, Jeff, I see.
Did you listen, by the way? You say, if I listen. Did you listen? Did
Should
you really listen?
I listen?
Okay.
Should I listen? One could have some silver linings. So we've been able to overcome these moments, the Red Scare, the first one, the second one. So why should we be so anxious about the current moment? It's a serious question. Is there something new about the current moment that is different from the 1990s, 1950s, that makes this moment more dangerous? Or it's like a virus that enters the body and then we fight against it, we develop new immunotherapies treatments, and then we'll be better off because we overcame it and we developed this resistance. Is it possible to think that way?
It's possible to think that way. You may even think that way. No, seriously, I would say two things in response to that.
I'm trying to find reasons
No,
for
no.
optimism.
No, it's good. It's good. Well, one thing is that the extent to which there has been progress on this dimension over time that has often had to be refought, it's because people didn't just wait for the virus to, have the fever and not take any medicine and not do anything and then you're better. It's because of forms of resistance and forms of democratic activism, some of which survive, and the memory of them survives, So that's part of it. If there hadn't been resistance in these past moments, I don't know that we would have gotten over it, okay? Or that we would have the resources to do so now. So that's part of it. But the other thing is, I do think this is unprecedented. I do. I think that the closest analogy to the current moment, and I'm not the only one who says this, obviously you could disagree with this, but the closest analogy is the period before the Civil War, okay, in 1860. I don't think that Woodrow Wilson during World War I, or FDR during World War II, or Eisenhower and Truman during the Cold War, or whatever, none of these people were as ready and willing to rip up the Constitution and turn the White House into a palace and say, I'm going to Trump 2028, and fuck you, really? So I think that this is really a different moment, and the fact that there's mass support for it makes it all the more dangerous. It's serious. I think that it's different. I do. But that doesn't mean to say that it's the end of the world or that we should be overcome with anxiety. We should be informed. We should talk. We should learn. And we should come together in different ways. I just can't tell you what to do.
I also think the fever is the wrong metaphor. Okay, it's more like a cancer. I'll just give you one example. So there are cases that Jeff could have mentioned. I just been reading about World War I, people protesting, right? So Wobblies, these radical unionists going out and basically getting arrested, all kinds of horrible things happening to them. And if you go, you take a course on free speech stuff. I'm also not a lawyer. It's amazing. It's there's a 1939 case in Jersey City involving labor unionists, where they basically finally overruled some of these terrible things that municipalities did. Basically people who are just handing out leaflets and just getting arrested or whatever, with no due process ultimately. So it's not just like a brief, nasty moment. That's how we like to look at the Red Scare. This stuff has lasting, and that's terrifying, So I'm not saying that means we just give up and get depressed about it, but it would be nice to think it's this brief moment and we kind of figure out what's going on. But unfortunately, I don't think the historical record supports that, or even another positive. Take another McCarthyism, lasting impact that had in this society in so many different ways. So
Yes.
I just
Thank you.
Sorry, that's it.
Oh, good. Yeah. Yes, and yeah.
Right. There's the question raised about why not have international students or immigrants, right? But there's also the opposing question of why should a citizen of the United States care, at least from a person from let's say from Appalachia or from the Rust Belt states, where the economic globalization has impacted hard. Gary, Indiana was supposed to be futuristic in 1960s, then the bamboo wall collapses, all the jobs go to China, India, all the lower income states, countries, and it kind of creates a resentment, and they believe the train has left the station. And there's kind of you might say there's a claim of truth that it's because of all this globalization that this has happened. And now, after this, these people from East Asia are coming to United States to take over the high-skilled jobs as well. How, as an American citizen, can I be for that? So, maybe I have a friend here, a friend there, and I just believe that diversity brings good food. So, I'm not concerned with any other benefits. So, why should an American citizen care?
Well, first of all, it's not my. I'll tell you why. But again, you're right. There are good reasons why a lot of people don't care that have nothing to do with racism. Have to do with their own circumstances, and then the kinds of resentments that are related to those circumstances. It's a challenge. So again, two kinds of answers. Obviously, a lot of work needs to be done on this. I don't mean academic work. I mean the work of convincing people that they should care. One answer is simply to say that America, we celebrate certain holidays and claim to stand for certain things. And I do think that some of what's going on is so egregiously contrary to that people ought to care. If they claim to care about, the 4th of July, or if they claim to believe that, that the Declaration of Independence matters, or that the United States is any kind of constitutional republic, what they're seeing is like a police state. So I think that, and I think this may be even having some effect. That's a reason why people should care, maybe. But the other part of this is immigration policy is a real issue that needs to be addressed. There is no easy answer to it. But there's no political way to deal with the issues that we're talking about that does not involve real immigration policies. That means, it does mean like some level of border security and some real procedures for processing asylum claims and immigration applications and whatever, and also leniency for people who are here, whatever. There needs to be policy. The Republicans don't want policy. They want this. So I do think that part of the answer is, how is it possible to actually promote real policies that are sensitive to these civil libertarian and other concerns that also make sense to people who in Gary, Indiana, or whatever. They are convinced that everyone who's not a supporter of Trump supports open borders and is like standing at the border welcoming rapists and drug peddlers and sex traffickers. Come into the country. Come to our cities. We'll sign you up for voting. Take over America. Take over American schools. Like destroy Americanism. That's not true. But I think the challenge is there's a real policy challenge. But the problem is there's a political party in this country that has not wanted to engage in real policy responses. Their policy response is the Trump policy response. So, but it's a real issue. It's a real political issue. I'm acknowledging the importance of what you're saying. Other, whatever.
It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, go.
I'm from like down south, right? And that's like a real, MAGA heavy concentrated area. And me being like, a liberal there with like my nuclear family. And as soon as Trump ran, my neighbor was like, him and his family just immediately got on board. And it was just like a mass conservative extremist movement in my area, right?
Yeah.
And whenever I would be like, why? And they're just like, because the economy, man. Oh.
Yeah.
And that's it. It's not like there's no grounds for anything really. It's just kind of like, I like Trump. Trump says goes. And they wave the Trump flag from their truck, and they live on Robert E. Lee Boulevard down there, you know. So I just think it's important to think about like what can you do about it, like has been said, and I don't really think there's much down there at least where you're a minority.
Can we take one more comment or question because we are already out of time?
Yeah.
So,
We can.
Yeah.
I mean, I can.
Yeah.
I can.
Okay, then,
So sort of a broad question kind of off of, but what would you say is your idea slash roadmap for how to destigmatize leftism and socialist ideas in this country?
What's my plan for destigmatizing leftist ideas?
If you were to propose a roadmap, what would you say?
I'm really not in the business of proposing roadmaps. Those people who either are democratic socialists, like Mamdani, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, many people who support them, need to keep doing what they're doing. And I think there's a lot of integrity in what's being done. And people like me need to talk, promote historical understanding. It's an uphill battle. I don't have a roadmap for it. I don't have a roadmap for it. Go on, follow up.
I don't continue. Oh,
Yeah, go on.
I mean, I wasn't going to say anything. Oh, are you done?
Well, I'm done, and if you have a follow up, I'm welcoming it.
I'm sorry, I do not.
You do not. Yes.
I would say like keeping yourself informed would be a good start. Like we kind of talked about it, but like being aware of like policy and like from a small scale, like who we're voting for, if you vote in Monroe County or wherever you vote, like who you're putting into office to make these decisions that impact all of us, what you're sharing, like I feel like that's a start.
let me add one thing completely on campus. What we can do, faculty and students, is to ask the president to open Bryan Hall, which is now locked. If you want to go and have a meeting with the president or anyone in administration, you cannot enter. So that's a demand that I think it's reasonable to make. Why are you keeping Bryan Hall locked? It had never been locked before. There's no reason. No one wants. There could be some security, of course, inside, but it's your house, your building. And there are other things that we can do to that effect. We can hold them accountable at our level. It's hard to hold accountable Trump or even Todd Young or Jim Banks or others once every 6 years, maybe. But here it's like you can do that. You can ask, open, unlock, Bryan Hall.
There are also other demands you can make locally that are more substantial than that, including like, why are you suspending the social work professor because she used an anti-racist chart that you don't like?
That's accurate.
Or why? I mean, there are, but that doesn't answer any big question, and certainly the question of how to destigmatize socialism. I think that is a huge problem. Quite honestly, that is one of the reasons why I no longer belong to Democratic Socialists of America. I was the student of, and then the colleague and friend of Michael Harrington, who was the founder of that organization in the 1970s. In certain places that works. I don't think at the level of the United States as a whole, socialism will ever be fully destigmatized. But it is worth pointing out that Bernie Sanders almost won the Democratic nomination in 2016. I don't believe he could have won the presidency. He might have won the presidency. He was very successful. He's for a while destigmatized socialism.
He's young. He has some future.
Yeah.
In the interest of, well, let me phrase it this way. So, do you see a way for someone for students on this campus, let's say, who disagree with liberal ideas, to engage with them in a way that does not, that doesn't get in the way of freedom of speech, or that doesn't support some of the things in their own party that they might disagree with? I know there was a point at which you said, there's one party in this country that's
That's pro-democracy.
right. So,
Right.
do you see in our current situation? Do you see somebody who's aware of these issues? Do you see a path where they don't support the Democratic Party, but combat the anti-freedom of speech strains and anti-constitution strains in their own party, or would you have this person, or do you see a future in? You only see one possibility in which this person ends up supporting the Democratic Party, like some of the people that you cited.
All the
Cheney
Democrat
and-
Republicans, right, yeah.
Yeah.
So, first of all, I do think it's possible on campus and in other spaces to have decent conversations. It's probably really hard. I'm not, that's not me. I'm not the guy to set up those conversations. Lisa Marie Napoli across the street and this PACE program is interested in that. It's not impossible, and so I'm not against that. I do think, honestly, I agree with Liz Cheney and Michael Ludwig and Bill Kristol, who I used to hate and he's now my friend. But I agree with those people, those former Republicans, those conservatives, that the only political solution to the issues that I'm talking about is the defeat of the Republican Party by the Democratic Party, the decisive defeat. What comes from a defeated Republican Party might be another kind of conservative party that's not, maybe all those people could go back and be leaders of a new Republican Party. Quite honestly, I don't see that happening. I don't think they see it happening.
I want to restate David's question. Do you think that reviving the center-right is the central charge of liberal society today? Center-right.
No, I don't think it's the central charge. It is a charge, and there are people trying to revive the center-right. There some of the people I mentioned. I liked some of them. I work with some of them. I support that. But that doesn't mean that I, as someone who's not on the center-right, needs for that to be the primary challenge. Those people aren't the people worrying, really in the forefront of worry about immigrant rights or civil liberties on campuses. Those are important issues. So I don't say the.
It's
Yes, absolutely. We agree. Professor Crayuto and I agree. I think that we ought to end on that note.
That's not great. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Professor Isaac.
Okay, so pizza is here. Thank you, gentlemen.
Why only pepperoni pizza? I wonder.
There was cheese as well.
It was a centralized top down like I'm down.